Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading Hellblazer number 123. And just a little catch up on what happened in the last issue. John is in New York with Dani to visit her family for Thanksgiving. But something has been following John. He noticed the feeling of something evil around him, and he kept seeing some kind of apparition following him at the airport. And it seemed like maybe some of the people that they were flying with and also in the airport were possessed momentarily. And this caused them to break out in fights. So John was aware something was going on, but he wasn't sure what. And then finally on the way to Dani's family's house, he was on a train and he saw the first of the fallen standing outside. So this kind of unsettled him, of course, but the first of the fallen wasn't attacking him, so he kind of went about his business with Dani's family. And then the first night they were there, the first of the fallen shows up, possesses Uncle Fred, seemingly just to taunt John. And then he brought John to some sort of hell dimension where there was like a wrestling rink and all this stuff happened where John was wrestling like the embodiment of America or something like that. But at the end of all that, John was given a riddle by the first of the fallen. And the riddle was, what is quiz? Like, I guess, what does the word quiz come from? So John has been trying to figure that out, but he has been unsuccessful as of yet. And then at the beginning of each of the issues of this storyline, we've been getting like 3 or 4 pages of this couple named Gavin and Pam. And apparently Gavin used to know John. And a couple years ago, Gavin and Pam hung out with John and Chaz. They had a couple beers. And then when Gavin drove Pam home, there was some sort of accident and she died. So we've been seeing Gavin kind of crying, looking like he's about to commit suicide with a gun, but he's also talking to some kind of apparition of Pam. So that's going on, but John doesn't know about any of that. In fact, John is in the middle of a family argument at Dani's house. Or I should say he's just watching while Dani's family argues about finding a gun in their youngest son Ethan's room. And this argument got heated enough that Terrell was calling Ethan an idiot, and Ethan did not like that, so he pulled the gun out, he pointed it at Terrell, and he pulled the trigger. And that's where we left off in the last issue. But first things first, with issue 123, we got the cover. We get a very large, out-of-focus John Constantine. He is in the background. And in the foreground is a shot glass, and in the golden liquid in the glass, we see reflections of what looks like a Vietnam battle scene. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Warren Pleece. And as we turn to the first page, we start off with Gavin, and it is 3:41 a.m. in the morning, and he is sitting up at bed staring at the moon, and he says, "I don't dream anymore. I used to, you know? Really interesting, colorful ones. Back when I was first studying the arts, I used to imagine I could see things, that I was connected. But now I know there's nothing really out there. The universe is empty." And then he puts his head in his hands and he begins to cry and he says, "Oh God, Pammy, I miss you so much. I haven't been able to think of anything else ever since I... And then we get an above shot of the bed and we see Pam is laying down next to him. And she is still all bloody. There's still a hole in her head. And she asks, "Ever since you killed me?" And Gavin doesn't answer. He just keeps his head in his hands and continues to cry. So she sits up next to him, puts a hand on his back, and kind of rubs him and says, "Shh, darling, these things happen. You mustn't blame yourself." And then he leans back onto her lap and looks into her eyes and says, But I have to. There's no one else to blame. I'll never forget what happened that night. Every split second imprinted on my soul. That terrible moment of impact, you were so beautiful. And the absolute serenity afterwards. Bits of debris rolling around and air rushing in my ears. All that blood. All over the nice white shirt you gave me." And then Pam interrupts, "It was blue." And Gavin says, "What?" And then Pam angrily sits up and says, "Your shirt. It was blue." And then Gavin stands up and goes to a bookshelf in his room And as he pulls a book off the shelf, he says, "Yes, well, I still have the book. The one I found at Portobello. I can't bear to look at it anymore." And as he flips through the pages, he says, "Remember how much John liked it? I should have given it to him. He would have appreciated the thing." And then he slams it shut and says, "God, I should have helped him with his silly bloody magic tricks. Then we wouldn't have been in the car." Then we see Pam get up and she walks to the door of his flat and she opens it and we can kind of see that she's actually transparent. Like we can see the branches of a tree behind her through her body. And she turns to Gavin and says, "I'm going now." And Gavin turns and says, But why?" And as she begins to walk out, she says, "Because you say you love me, but you don't. And you never did." Then we turn the page and we cut to Dani's family's house, where we pick up right where we left off with Ethan having pulled the trigger on the gun and the bullet is just leaving the barrel. And this one millisecond of time is actually spread across 4 panels as we see the bullet travel through the room towards Terrell. And over those panels, the narration says, "It always ends in a flash, but that's never the beginning. Ray Butkus installs the main springs. His dad has testicular cancer. Never owned a shooter. Devin Walker treats the barrels. Wishes he'd listened in high school. Then he wouldn't be working here. Arlene Kite works in packaging. Sometimes when she thinks her Kevin's doing homework, he's really at the mall with his buds. Sometimes when she thinks hubby's working late, he's fucking her best friend in the tool shed. She believes in alien abduction and copper bracelets for rheumatism. And that guns don't kill people. People kill people." So as we get a breakdown of the people who manufactured this gun, I guess, the bullet flies through the room. Then as we turn the page, we just see the barrel smoking and everybody looks astonished, and the narration continues. "Everyone has an idea of how it works, but nobody wants to comprehend it. You just point the thing and pull the trigger. Hammer comes down, firing pin hits primer, bullet comes out, and then everyone trusts to luck." And in the panel under this narration, we see Ethan smiling at Terrell, and Terrell is looking down at his chest for bullet holes, and luckily, we don't see any. And then Terrell turns around, and he looks at the window behind him, and there is a hole in it. And once again, Ethan doesn't look very sad or shocked about this. He's just holding that sinister smile, and then Grandpa goes up to him and says, "Go to your room." And this actually shakes Ethan because he looks like he's got a sad look on his face. And we also see on this page that the name of the issue is Up the Down Staircase Part 3. Then we turn the page and we cut to the next morning and we see Terrell and his wife are not talking, sitting at the breakfast table while the mom does some dishes. And the narration says, "Naturally, everyone tries to ignore what's happened. And over the next few days, things get worse. Family values begin to decay, like week-old Thanksgiving turkey." Then we get a panel of Ethan and Edwick, the twins, and they are putting a CD inside of a stereo in the living room as Uncle Fred is trying to watch TV, and we can see he's covering his ears because their music is too loud. And we can see the mom has come into the living room and she's about to yell at them. And the narration says, "The twins take great delight in fanning the flames of Mary's annoyance. Neither of them even likes gangsta rap mind, but it's a good way to piss off the old lady." Then we cut to John and Dani outside, and they are smoking on the porch, and they are staring at Kyle, the third brother, who is on crutches, and he is just below them on the driveway. And the narration says, "Still, when it comes to making a supreme bid for spastic superstardom, the out-and-out winner has to be Kyle. As I understand it, a lot of role model athletes are going in for the clueless wanker look these days." And it took me a second to figure out what John's talking about in the art here, because we just see Kyle standing there looking kind of pissed at them as Dani makes fun of him saying, "Jesus, move over, RuPaul." But to me, Kyle just looks perfectly normal. But I think what they're commenting on is that he dyed his hair like platinum blonde and it's super short. So I guess John was saying he looks like an athlete. So maybe he's talking about Dennis Rodman. And then Dani's saying he looks like RuPaul. But that's just my guess because he looks perfectly normal to me. I guess because the 90s dyed hair is crazy or something. But anyway, then we turn the page and we cut to John and Dani in the kitchen, and they're sitting at the table with Terrell's wife. And the wife is talking to Dani, but John just has his head in his hands like he's getting a migraine or something, and he doesn't want to be here. And the narration over this panel says, "Worse still, Terrell's horrible bloody wife decides that the only two people in the world who truly understand are her sister-in-law and by extension, yours truly. Next thing I know, I'm barraged by conversations that contain the phrases self-adjustment and personal space." Then we cut to a panel of Dani walking out of the house with her skis, and John's narration says, "This is all fine with my loyal bloody girlfriend mind. She's got an out, hasn't she?" Then we see John sitting on the porch with Grandpa, and it seems like it's getting colder now because Grandpa is wearing heavy winter clothes. And as John lights a cigarette next to him, his narration says, "But me, about the only person I've got anything in common with is the least likely suspect of all." And then Grandpa says to John, "Won't be long now. You mark my words, John, little fools. They got everything they need to make a go of life. Doing good in school, too. But this crazy-ass world's just running things for them. Now they're making excuses for why they're gonna fail. And they will, if they keep this up. It's just a matter of time." And as Grandpa says this, we get a panel that shows the brothers getting arrested by the police. But this looks to be like foreshadowing or maybe a daydream. And as we turn the page, we see the daydream continues as the brothers are being led shirtless by a police officer that has a rope tied to their wrists, and he's leading them up to a staircase. And the policeman is saying, "Come on, boys, step lively." And then we see him leading them up to the gallows, and we see John now is following them. And then in the next panel, we see the officer pulling the lever, and he's saying, "Only one way for the likes of you." Then we see John's shocked face, and then we get a pulled out shot of a hangman's gallows, and it looks like the three brothers are hanging, and that lever that the guard pulled was to open the trap doors. Then we see that the guard has now transformed to the first of the fallen, and he's staring down at John, and he finishes the sentence that the guard said before about there only being one way to go for the likes of you. And the first says, "Down." And as the brothers are hanging there, we get a close-up panel where one of them stares at John, and we can see that orange energy is now coming from all of their eyes. And Ethan turns to John and says, "Constantine, you ain't no closer than you was before. You ain't even trying." And then Edric turns to him and says, "What's the matter, Holmes? We only worth the effort when you hit in the skins with our sister." And then Kyle turns to him and says, "He don't care. Ain't even found out what quiz is." Then John turns around, and we see all of Dani's family, except for her, are watching this whole scene play out. And John says, "Jesus." And as the first smiles and walks over to him, John says, "What's going on? Why do they need to be here?" And the first answers, "Why do you think? They're witnesses to your ineptitude." And then it looks like he's reaching for his gun, but when he brings it up, it is just the TV controller, and as the orange energy comes out of the top of it, he kind of blows on it like he just fired a shot. Then we see a person materialize next to the first, and it looks like a woman. It's probably Dani, but she has a bag over her head, and the first motions to her and says, "I must say, I'm disappointed in you, Constantine. I never took you for a slacker. These po little chitlins. Fancy relying on you to help, of all people." And then he removes the bag over the woman's head, and we do see it is in fact Dani. And the first continues saying, "And your little sweetmeat. I haven't got her. Not yet. But you keep this pace up, and I will." Then we get a close-up of her face, and the orange energy is coming out of her eyes, and it looks like her face is melting off. And she stares at John and says, "John?" But then we get a panel that looks almost exactly the same, except Dani looks normal, and she's saying, "John?" Then we get a wide shot panel where we can see her laying in bed next to John, and she's staring at him, and she asks, "Did you just wet the fucking bed?" And John, of course, looks surprised and maybe a little ashamed. Then we turn the page, and we cut back to Gavin, the man whose girlfriend died, and he's now sitting on his couch, reading the magic book and drinking alcohol. And we see the ghost of Pam is sitting next to him in a chair, and she's looking at him very angrily, and she says, "You're happier without me, aren't you, Gavin?" And Gavin stands up, and he rushes over to her, and he says, "Pammy, oh God, you're back. Why did you have to go?" And then he falls to his knees in front of her, and she looks down at him and says, "Because it's quite clear that you don't love me, even though you claim you do." And Gavin looks up at her and says, "Nah, but I do. I've always loved you." And Pam looks down with disdain and says, "If you loved me, you wouldn't have forgotten." And Gavin's confused and he says, I don't understand." And she answers, "Every split second, you said, imprinted on your soul. You said your shirt was white, and it was blue. You forgot." And then she leans forward and says, "And that evening, Gavin, don't you remember? It was raining." Then we get a couple panels of Gavin remembering, and it shows them walking through the rain with the umbrella. And then we see that the bookstore is actually closed. And Gavin speaks to her, and he narrates over these panels saying, "Yes, it was raining. We were tired. It was cold, and we wanted to go home, to be together. They said it was going to snow, but I had to stay. I was looking for a book, wasn't I?" Then we cut back to the room, and we see Pam is leaning forward, and she grabs his chin, and she says, "Yes, but you didn't find it." And then it seems like maybe she pulled him up from his chin and made him go off balance, because he falls backwards and he asks, "I didn't?" And she says, "No. So we were going home to bed, to be warm and together, and then something happened." And I will say that as he fell backwards, his hand is literally on the book. So it seems like Pam is trying to brainwash him or make him misremember what happened. So then we cut to this fake memory that she's, I guess, implanting in him. And we see Gavin and Pam are about to get in their car, but all of a sudden John and Chaz and Muppet walk up, and John sees him and says, "Fucking hell, it's Gav the Wank. You in for a pint, old son?" And a surprised Gavin turns to him and says, We were just going home, actually, John." And John says, "No, you weren't, mate." Then we cut to them inside the bar, where we see Gavin is kind of nervously listening to John, and Pam looks very bored as they all stand around and drink. And it seems like it's pretty loud in the bar, so he's kind of screaming this to Gavin as he says, "Har, you see the tits on her mind? Ginormous bastards they were. Nipples like bloody organ stops." And Gavin nervously replies, "Blimey, John, steady on, eh?" Then we get a panel of John hugging on Gavin. We see Chaz is walking out the door behind him, and he's yelling, "Oi, Constantine, we were off down the King's Arms. You coming?" And a very drunk John holding Gavin says, "I'm staying here with me best mate, Chaz. Just me and the Wank, right, Wank?" Then we cut back to present, where Pam has a very evil look on her face, and she says, "Good old John. Of all these horrible friends of yours, he was the only one with the slightest sense of, honor." Then we cut back into the flashback, and we see John and Gavin are super drunk leaving the bar, and Pam is walking behind them, and John and Gavin are singing, "When the train is at the station, please refrain from urination, have regard for railway property." And Pam is saying sarcastically, "I'll drive, shall I?" But John kind of shoves Gavin into the driver's seat and says, "Nah, Gav's all right. He's me best mate. He can drive with one eye tied behind his back. Right, Gav?" And Gav belches loudly and says, "That's right." And as Gavin and Pam drive away, John waves at them and says, "Away, you fuckers. Drive fast and take chances." Then we cut to present, where Pam has her eyes closed, like she's sad about what's about to happen to them in that car. And she says, "Bloody John, eh? You just would have thought he'd have more sense than to pressure you like that. Such a thoughtless thing to do, for a supposedly honorable sort of man." And as she says this, we get a zoomed-in look at the book that was on the floor next to Gavin. And this whole time, we've kind of thought it was the magic book that previously we had thought Gavin brought to John in the bar, but now Pam is saying that they never found a book and they were just in the bar drinking with John all night. And as we zoom in on the book, we finally see the cover of it, and it says Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare. So as the reader, we're not really sure what's the true story. Pam seems kind of evil. She is a supernatural being of some kind. We're not sure of her motivations. So all of what she just said might be fake, including this book saying Julius Caesar. That might be some kind of magic trick that she did to make it look like that. Then we turn the page, and we cut to John standing in the snow somewhere, and he's smoking under a tree. Then we cut to the groundskeeper of the VA hospital, and it seems like John is waiting by a tree just up the drive from him, and the groundskeeper singing, "There's something happening around here," which is a line from the song For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield, and you've definitely heard it if you've ever watched a Vietnam-era movie. So as the groundskeeper walks past John's tree, John kind of pops out behind him and says, "Hello, mate, remember me?" And the man says, "Ha, it's the bloody poofta. What can I do for you, England?" And John holds up an ad from the newspaper, and it has the word "it" in bold letters, and John says, "You can tell me about this." And the groundskeeper grabs it and examines it, and he says, "Huh, what's this supposed to be?" And John replies, "I'm asking you." And then the groundskeeper throws it to the side, and he begins to walk away from John, saying, "What the fuck would I know about it, English? And why would you care? And even if I did know anything, why the fuck would I tell you about it? I don't even know you." And John follows after him, saying, "'Cause I'm up shit creek, and I don't know what the fuck to do about it. 'Cause there's something fucking weird going on, and my bird's family is in it up to their tits. And if I don't sort it out soon, it's gonna be a bloodbath, mate." But the man doesn't stop walking, so John reaches out and puts a hand on his shoulder, and he says, "Look, I can't put my finger on it, but I get a sense out of you, all right? I mean, everyone around here's got some exploit me sign pinned to their back. The fact that you don't seem to give a bullock is the precise reason I'm here." And then he reaches into his coat pocket and pulls out a bottle of Jack Daniels and smiles and says, "5 minutes of your time." Then we turn the page and we cut to a panel of them sitting in a room and drinking. And John's narration says, "Turns out his name is George, a resident at the local veterans hospital. Hardly the friendliest chap, but you can tell there's something under the veneer." So as George sips his whiskey, he says to John, "You're too young for anything but the Falklands, and that was a pussy little schoolyard fight. Anything I gotta say, candy-ass like you wouldn't understand." And then John takes a sip of his whiskey and stares right back at him and says, "You mean how all that gunfire smells like burnt curry? How, in the middle of it all, you fixate on one sound and never let go of it? How calm it is with all those furious little bees zipping around you? And how you always fixate on what you had for breakfast the last time you saw your girl?" And then George takes another drink and says, "Huh, so you done your time? When?" And we get a flashback of that time John was in the memory of the soldier that had possessed the flat that no one could find. And he was like in that guy's memories during World War II. And we specifically get the panel of that soldier holding his rifle over his head in the water. And of course, there's bombs and bullets and everything flying by him. And John smiles as he closes his eyes and remembers that and answers, "Past life." And this answer kind of throws George, and he says, Okay. You seem like a guy who knows bullshit when he smells it, but you don't know about real bullshit." And as he pours John another drink, he says, "See, you think you know the story because it begins like all the rest. Once upon a time, I went to Nam. I was a Marine. Unlike most of the kids who pissed their pants in the bush, I trained for 5 years before I did my tour. Marines had a different deal from the grunts. A Marine was on top, just going through the motions, and the enemy was just so many human targets. We did our shit, and we did it well. There ain't no feeling of power in the world like standing in the middle of hell, only you're wearing asbestos drawers. 5 years, I did my turn, and in all that time, every single mission went like clockwork, just like I was trained to expect. Problem was, I came home." And while George was talking, we're kind of getting little flashes of him in the military. We just see him with his unit, and they're walking through, water and stuff with their rifles above their heads. And then we're seeing helicopters fly above. Then we turn the page and we see George watching TV in his uniform in his office. And his narration continues saying, "So 1 minute you're drowning in a fucking swamp. Next thing you know, you're drowning in paperwork. But soldiers get paid to do the job either way. We did ours, so no problem, right? Wrong. The real world ain't about jolly old cricket. It's about winners and losers. There ain't no gray area here. If you don't win, you lose." Then we see what's on the TV in his office is a news report talking about how they've lost Vietnam. Then we cut to present, and a very serious George is saying to John, "That's why America was so pissed, man. We ain't got the patience for something to end in a tie." Then we cut to another of his flashbacks where we see George walking through the streets of his hometown with fellow Marines, And there are people in the background who have signs that say baby killers. And over this panel, George's narration continues saying, "Now, these ad agencies and filmmakers see this, right? And they realize there's a ton of money to be made out of everyone's anger. So they figure, why don't we go back and win it this time? You'd see it in every made-for-TV movie written by some Hollywood queer, never got his feet wet in his life. We went back and kicked ass. Every left uppercut connected flush on our greedy glass jaws. Every bullet that killed another Kong hit us right in our damn wallets. And the more worked up we got, the more them fuckers was laughing all the way to the bank." And over this narration, we're getting flashes from movie scenes. We're seeing like a pastiche of Rambo. And we're also seeing Ronald Reagan giving the thumbs up. And we're seeing people going into a movie theater. It's kind of like a collage of all these different images. Then we cut away from the flashback back to the room. And George is saying, "They created a spiritual cancer with their bottled patriotism. And it didn't stop there. Not by a long shot. It was only a matter of time before it took on a life of its own. Common sense don't stand a chance next to disingenuous sales patter. Sad thing is, everyone claims they can see through it, and just about nobody does." And then John smiles and says, "Me and you included." And then George picks up his glass to take a big drink and he says, "I've given them motherfuckers enough. You really think I'm going to help them feed their machine?" And then he empties the glass and John says, "I suppose not, mate. Here, you're a college-educated bloke. I don't suppose you know what quiz is, do you?" And as George sets his empty glass on the table, he says, "As a matter of fact, I do." Then we turn the page and we cut to some snowy ski slopes and we see Dani is going down them. And on the balcony of the lodge nearby, we see John is smoking and watching her. And John's narration says, "Maybe there's a way to beat it. An antidote for the psychic poison. Maybe it's buried in the few remaining brain cells that haven't been toasted by white noise. Maybe it's the ability to strap on a pair of boots and go out and do something nobody would expect of you. Maybe it's the catching of breath in pursuit of seemingly pointless exercise. Maybe the only way to conquer the infection is to conquer the metaphorical mountain. Maybe everyone should try it." Then we see Dani stop at the bottom of the slope, and she looks up and sees John watching her, and she waves at him, and he raises a glass and smiles at her. And then she holds up her ski poles like she's going to hand them to him, and she asks, "You ready to go, hun?" And he kind of smiles back at her, and his narration says, "Maybe." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.